A. Comprehensive History of the United States, from colonial settlements to the 21st century, the formation of a nation, beginnings to 1877. Chapter, Worlds Collide, Pre-Columbian America and European Contact Societies of the Americas, before Columbus, long before the arrival of Europeans in the late 15th century. The continents of North and South America were home to a vast and diverse array of indigenous cultures and civilizations. The notion of the Americas as a sparsely populated, primitive wilderness is a historical misconception that obscures a complex human tapestry woven over millennia. The societies that developed across North America were characterized by a remarkable variety of social, political, and economic structures, each intricately adapted to its specific environment. These adaptations influence every aspect of life, from diet and governance to trade and religious belief. Likely migrated from Asia across the Beringia land bridge at least 10,000 years ago, spreading throughout the Americas as mobile bands of hunter-gatherers. These small groups, typically consisting of extended family units, subsisted by hunting large, now extinct megafauna like mastodons and ancient bison. As the climate stabilized around 10,000 years ago, these early peoples coalesced into hundreds of distinct linguistic and cultural groups, each developing unique traditions and social structures. Over time, many of these societies transitioned from nomadic lifestyles to more settled agricultural communities. This agricultural revolution was largely based on the cultivation of maize, corn, beans, and squash, a trio of crops that formed the foundation of many indigenous diets and economies. The development of agriculture allowed for a significant rise in population and the emergence of complex, sedentary civilizations. In the American Southwest, the ancestral Puebloans constructed remarkable cliff dwellings and adobe structures, developing sophisticated irrigation systems to farm in an arid landscape. In the Ohio and Mississippi River valleys, the Mississippian culture flourished, known for its large urban centers. These societies possessed complex societal hierarchies with organized governance and resource management systems that provided resilience against environmental challenges like drought. The institutional frameworks of these societies were as varied as their economies. Governance ranged from the kin-based organization of small bands to the centralized, hierarchical political structures of major civilizations like the Maya and Aztecs in Mesoamerica. In North America, confederacies like the Iroquois developed more decentralized forms of governance based on consensus decision-making among allied tribes. Regardless of their scale, all indigenous societies possessed organized political structures, moral codes, and intricate systems of religious belief. A fundamental concept that distinguished most Native American societies from their European counterparts was the approach to land use. The idea of private land ownership was largely foreign. Land was typically held communally and worked collectively, viewed as a resource to be shared and sustained, rather than a commodity to be bought and sold. Extensive trade networks connected these diverse societies across vast distances, facilitating not only economic exchange but also the spread of ideas, technologies, and cultural practices. The presence of seashells from coastal regions and inland archaeological sites, for example, attests to the reach of these commercial routes. Through this interconnected system, agricultural techniques, religious beliefs, and artistic styles were shared, enriching the cultures of the continent. The pre-Columbian Americas were not a static wilderness, but a dynamic and populated continent. The existing trade, agricultural, and political networks established by indigenous peoples would profoundly, though often invisibly, shape the patterns of European colonization. The success, failure, and geographic distribution of early European colonies were not solely determined by European actions, but were significantly influenced by this pre-existing human landscape. The New World was, in fact, an Old World to its inhabitants, and this reality shaped the colonial encounter from its very beginning. Motivations for European exploration, God, which historians have traditionally summarized as God. These three forces, religious zeal, economic ambition, and national pride propelled European nations across the Atlantic and set in motion the collision of worlds that would reshape global history. The social and institutional drive, encapsulated by God, was deeply rooted in the religious history of Europe. The Crusades, a series of religious wars from the 11th to the 13th centuries aimed at reclaiming the Holy Lands from Muslim control, had a lasting impact on the European psyche. They fostered a militant religious ideology and dramatically increased maritime trade and contact with the East. This legacy was carried forward in the Reconquista, the centuries-long campaign by Christian kingdoms to expel Muslims from the Iberian Peninsula, modern-day Spain and Portugal. The Reconquista cemented a culture of religious intolerance and conquest, which in turn inspired the ambitions of Atlantic colonization. For the strongly Catholic nations of Spain and Portugal, exploration was not merely a secular enterprise, but a sacred mission to convert new populations to Christianity and establish the global dominance of the Church. The economic motive, gold, was perhaps the most powerful and immediate driver of exploration. For centuries, Europeans had coveted the luxury goods of the East: spices, silk, and porcelain, which traveled along the slow and costly Silk Road. This trade was largely controlled by Muslim middlemen who collected taxes and kept the location of lucrative sources, like the Spice Islands in modern-day Indonesia, a closely guarded secret. The lure of immense profit pushed European merchants and monarchs to seek a direct water route to Asia that would bypass these intermediaries and break the Muslim monopoly on Eastern trade. The prospect of finding vast reserves of precious metals, like the gold and silver that Spain would eventually extract from the Americas, was a tantalizing incentive for explorers and their financial backers. The potential for cultivating valuable cash crops such as sugar on newly discovered lands further fueled this economic ambition. The political motivation, glory, reflected the intense competition among the emerging nation-states of Europe. The 15th and 16th centuries were a period of political consolidation, as monarchs sought to centralize power and expand their influence. Building a colonial empire was a primary means of demonstrating national strength, gaining strategic military advantages, and achieving global recognition. Nations like Spain, Portugal, France, and England vied with one another to claim new territories, establish trade outposts, and project their power across the oceans. The acquisition of colonies was a key component of mercantilism, an economic theory that held that a nation's wealth and power were best served by increasing exports and accumulating precious metals. In this competitive environment, the glory of the nation and its monarch was inextricably linked to the success of its explorers and the expansion of its overseas empire. Technological innovations, such as the caravel, a small, fast ship, the astrolabe, and the compass, made these long-distance voyages of conquest and commerce possible, enabling the ambitions of God, gold, and glory to be realized on a global scale. The Columbian Exchange, a new global ecology. The arrival of Christopher Columbus in the Americas in 1492 initiated a profound and permanent transformation of the world's human and ecological systems. This transatlantic transfer of plants, animals, diseases, technologies, peoples, and ideas is known as the Columbian Exchange. It was not a balanced or equal exchange, with far-reaching social and economic consequences that continue to shape the modern world. The most immediate and devastating social impact of the exchange was the introduction of Old World diseases to the Americas. Pathogens such as smallpox, measles, and influenza, to which European populations had developed some immunity over centuries, were entirely new to the Western Hemisphere. The indigenous peoples of the Americas had no natural defenses against these diseases, resulting in catastrophic epidemics that swept through communities, in some cases wiping out entire populations. This demographic collapse, which saw the Native American population decrease rapidly between 1492 and 1650, was a crucial factor in the relative ease of European conquest and colonization. The depopulation of the Americas created a power vacuum and a severe labor shortage, which Europeans first attempted to fill with indentured servants and then, with enslaved Africans brought forcibly across the Atlantic. Conversely, the Columbian Exchange had a dramatically different demographic effect on the Old World. The introduction of nutrient-rich American crops, most notably potatoes and maize, corn, revolutionized agriculture and diets in Europe, Africa, and Asia. These crops could be grown in soils unsuitable for traditional Old World staples and produced higher yields, leading to a more abundant and reliable food supply. The potato, for example, became a staple food in places like Ireland and is credited with contributing to an estimated 25% of the population growth in Afro-Eurasia between 1700. This unprecedented population boom in the Old World provided a surplus of people, many of whom would migrate to the now depopulated Americas in the centuries that followed. Economically, the Columbian Exchange created new global trade networks and fundamentally altered the world's economies. The introduction of European livestock, such as horses, cattle, and pigs, transformed American ecosystems and Native American societies. The horse, in particular, revolutionized transportation, hunting, and warfare for many indigenous groups, especially on the Great Plains. The establishment of vast plantations in the Americas to cultivate cash crops like sugarcane and tobacco, which relied on the exploitative labor of enslaved Africans, became a cornerstone of the colonial economy and generated immense wealth for European powers. This influx of new commodities and wealth from the Americas into Europe helped to fuel the economic shift from feudalism toward capitalism. This interconnected cycle, where disease led to depopulation, creating the demand for forced labor to produce new global commodities, which in turn enriched a growing European population, was not a planned outcome but a cascading series of consequences. It established the economic and demographic foundations of the modern Atlantic world. Africa as a source of forced labor was not merely a trade but a biological and economic upheaval that created the world's first truly global system, establishing new hierarchies of power based on immunological advantage and control of new commodities. Chapter: The Colonial Experiment 1607 to 1763, Models of Colonization, Spanish, French, Dutch, and English Approaches. The European colonization of the Americas was not a monolithic enterprise. The major powers, Spain, France, the Netherlands, and England, Each developed distinct colonial models shaped by their national goals, economic priorities, and interactions with indigenous populations. These differing approaches created vastly different societies in the New World and set the stage for future imperial conflicts. The Spanish, as the first Europeans to establish a large-scale empire in the Americas, pursued a model of direct extraction and religious conversion. Their primary goals were to find and exploit precious metals like gold and silver, and to convert Native Americans to Catholicism. To achieve this, Spain established a highly centralized and bureaucratic colonial administration. A key institution was the encomienda system, which granted Spanish colonists the right to demand tribute and forced labor from indigenous communities, effectively a form of slavery. This system, combined with the devastating impact of European diseases, led to the brutal exploitation and demographic collapse of native populations. Spanish colonization created a rigid, hierarchical society with a complex racial caste system, castas, that placed Europeans at the top, followed by people of mixed heritage, mestizos. The Spanish model was most extensively applied in regions that were already densely populated and had highly developed pre-colonial societies, such as the Aztec and Inca empires, as this provided a ready source of labor to exploit. In contrast, the French and Dutch models were primarily commercial in nature, centered on the lucrative fur trade, who sought to conquer and subjugate large native populations. The French and Dutch depended on Native Americans as essential partners in the fur trade. This economic reality fostered more cooperative and interdependent relationships. French and Dutch traders often formed military alliances with indigenous groups, supplied them with European goods like firearms. Consequently, French and Dutch settlements, such as Quebec and New Amsterdam, later New York, were generally smaller, more sparsely populated, and more focused on trade than on large-scale agriculture. While French Jesuit missionaries did attempt to convert Native Americans to Catholicism, their approach was often less coercive than that of the Spanish. The Dutch, known for their commercial prowess, established New Netherland as a diverse, tolerant trading hub that welcomed a variety of European immigrants and even allowed Jewish settlers. The English model of colonization differed significantly from the others, primarily in its emphasis on large-scale settlement and agriculture. English colonization was driven not just by merchants and soldiers, but by thousands of men, women, and families seeking economic opportunity or religious freedom. This demographic pattern meant that the English established permanent, populous, and land-hungry agricultural communities. This focus on acquiring land for farming inevitably brought them into direct and sustained conflict with Native American populations. The English generally sought to displace indigenous peoples from their lands rather than incorporate them into colonial society as laborers like the Spanish, or trade with them as partners like the French and Dutch. This led to a pattern of warfare and removal that characterized English-Indian relations. While the English also sought wealth, they did not find the vast gold and silver deposits the Spanish had. Instead, their economic success came from agriculture, particularly the cultivation of tobacco in the Chesapeake region, which created a voracious demand for both land and labor. The development of colonial regions, New England, though all under the nominal control of the British Crown, evolved into 3 distinct regions, each with its own unique social. These differences were shaped by a combination of factors, including the motivations of their founders, geography and climate, and the composition of their settler populations. These regional distinctions would lay the groundwork for the sectional tensions that later defined much of American history. New England colonies, the colonies of Massachusetts. Free from the perceived corruption of the Church of England, this religious motivation profoundly shaped New England society. Life was centered around tight-knit, religiously homogeneous towns. The institutional framework of governance was the town meeting, where male property holders could vote on local matters, which reflected the Puritan belief in a sacred agreement between God and his people. Socially, New England was characterized by the migration of families, resulting in a relatively balanced gender ratio and a high rate of natural population growth. There was a strong emphasis on education, primarily to ensure literacy for reading the Bible, which led to the founding of institutions like Harvard College. Economically, the region's rocky soil and cold climate made large-scale plantation agriculture impractical. Instead, New England developed a mixed economy based on small subsistence farms, fishing, lumber, shipbuilding, and maritime trade. Middle colonies, comprising New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware, this region was the most ethnically and religiously diverse of the 3. It attracted a wide range of settlers from different European nations, including the English, Dutch, Swedes, and Germans, and was home to numerous religious groups such as Quakers, Mennonites, Lutherans, and Presbyterians. This pluralism, particularly in Pennsylvania under the guidance of its Quaker founder William Penn, fostered an institutional climate of religious tolerance that was unusual for the era. Socially, the middle colonies were more cosmopolitan and varied than New England. Economically, the region benefited from fertile soil and a temperate climate, earning it the nickname the breadbasket colonies for its large exports of wheat and other grains. The economy was a blend of prosperous family farms and a thriving commercial sector centered on port cities like Philadelphia and New York, which became major hubs for trade and industry. Southern colonies. The colonies of Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia were founded primarily for economic gain rather than religious freedom. The region's warm climate and rich soil were ideal for large-scale agriculture, leading to the development of a plantation-based economy centered on the cultivation of labor-intensive cash crops like tobacco. This economic system created a hierarchical social structure dominated by a wealthy elite class of large plantation owners who held significant political and economic power. The vast majority of the population consisted of small yeoman farmers, a large population of enslaved Africans who formed the backbone of the plantation labor force. Politically, while early representative institutions like the Virginia House of Burgesses were established, power was largely concentrated in the hands of the wealthy planter class. A comparative analysis of these regions reveals their distinct characters. New England was primarily driven by the quest for religious freedom for Puritans, who sought to create a city upon a hill. The Middle Colonies were motivated by economic opportunity and a spirit of religious tolerance, which attracted a diverse mix of immigrants. The Southern colonies were founded almost entirely for economic gain, focusing on agriculture and land speculation. Their economic bases were also quite different. New England developed a mixed economy of small farms, fishing, lumber, shipbuilding, and maritime trade. The Middle Colonies, known as the breadbasket colonies, focused on large-scale grain farming and commerce in major port cities. The Southern economy was defined by plantation agriculture, centered on cash crops like tobacco, rice, and indigo. These economies were supported by different labor systems. New England relied mostly on family labor, with some indentured servants and a small number of enslaved people. The Middle Colonies used a mix of family farms, indentured servants, and a growing number of enslaved laborers. The South, however, transitioned from an initial reliance on indentured servants to a heavy dependence on chattel slavery to work its large plantations. Socially, New England was structured around family, town, and church, with high literacy and a relatively egalitarian society among white male property owners. The Middle Colonies were the most socially diverse and tolerant, with more social mobility. The South developed a rigid hierarchical society dominated by a wealthy planter elite, with a large population of enslaved people at the bottom. Finally, their political and institutional frameworks reflected these differences. New England was characterized by town meetings with direct democracy for male church members and a strong sense of community governance. The Middle Colonies operated under proprietary charters and elected colonial assemblies, with a mix of town and county governments. In the South, political power was concentrated in county governments and representative assemblies, like the House of Burgesses, which were dominated by the wealthy planter class. Labor systems, from indentured servitude to chattel slavery. The economic development of the British American colonies was predicated on the availability of a vast and exploitable labor force, from the temporary servitude of Europeans to the permanent, was a critical institutional and social development that profoundly shaped the character of the colonies. In the early 17th century, the primary solution to the colonies' insatiable need for labor was indentured servitude, which had roots in English labor practices. Involved individuals signing a contract, by which they agreed to work for a master for a fixed period, in exchange for passage to America. Upon completion of their service, indentured servants were granted their freedom and, in some cases, freedom dues, which might include land, tools, or money. This system was particularly prevalent in the tobacco-producing colonies of Virginia and Maryland. The Virginia Company of London further incentivized this practice through the creation of the headright system in 1618, which awarded 50 acres of land to any colonist who paid for the passage of a new immigrant to the colony. This allowed successful planters to acquire both land and labor simultaneously, fueling the expansion of the tobacco economy. For many impoverished Europeans, indentured servitude offered a path to economic opportunity and land ownership that was unattainable in their home countries. However, by the late 17th century, the colonial labor system began a dramatic and fateful shift away from indentured servitude and toward chattel slavery. Several factors drove this transition. The improving economic conditions in England led to a decline in the number of people willing to sign indentures. Colonial planters also grew wary of the system of temporary servitude, creating social and political tensions, a dynamic that exploded in 1676 with Bacon's Rebellion in Virginia, where a coalition of former indentured servants and other landless men rose up against the colonial government. This rebellion instilled a deep fear among the planter elite of a large restive class of landless white men and made a more permanent, controllable labor force seem more appealing. Enslaved Africans provided this alternative. Unlike indentured servants, their bondage was for life, and, critically, it was inheritable, meaning the children of enslaved mothers were also born into slavery. This created a self-perpetuating labor force. The development of the transatlantic slave trade made enslaved Africans more readily available, and colonial legislatures began to codify the institution of chattel slavery into law. These slave codes stripped Africans of their basic human rights, defined them as property chattel, and established a system of bondage based explicitly on race. While slavery existed in all the colonies, it became the economic engine of the South, where the plantation economy's demand for a large, stable, and exploitable workforce was greatest. This transition institutionalized a system of racial hierarchy and economic exploitation that would become the central conflict in American history: colonial society, the Enlightenment. Two major intellectual and religious movements swept through the American colonies, profoundly shaping their social and political landscape: the Enlightenment and the Great Awakening. These movements, combined with the practical experience of local governance, planted the seeds of a distinct American identity and laid the groundwork for the revolution to come. The Enlightenment, an international intellectual movement that emphasized reason, science, and individual liberty, had a powerful influence on the colonial elite. Thinkers like John Locke articulated revolutionary ideas about natural rights, the rights to life, liberty, and property, and the concept of a social contract, which held that governments derive their legitimacy from the consent of the governed. These principles were eagerly absorbed by colonial leaders such as Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin, who came to believe that societies could and should establish good government through reflection and choice, rather than relying on the accident and force of monarchy and inherited aristocracy. The Enlightenment provided a rational, secular vocabulary for challenging the authority of the British Crown and Parliament and for envisioning a new form of republican government based on popular sovereignty. At the same time, the Great Awakening, a series of religious revivals that swept the colonies from the 1730s to the 1760s, had a transformative effect on the broader population. Charismatic preachers like George Whitefield and Jonathan Edwards rejected the cold formalism of established churches and preached a message of personal, emotional salvation. They emphasized an individual's direct relationship with God, empowering ordinary people to challenge the authority of established ministers and church hierarchies. This revivalist fervor cut across colonial and class lines, creating one of the first truly shared American experiences. The Great Awakening led to the rise of new, more democratic Protestant denominations, such as Baptists and Methodists, and fostered a spirit of religious pluralism and individualism. These two movements, one celebrating reason and the other emotion, paradoxically worked in concert to weaken traditional hierarchies and empower the individual. The Enlightenment provided colonial leaders with the political philosophy to question the authority of the king, while the Great Awakening provided the general populace with a parallel experience of questioning the authority of the established church. This dual challenge, operating on different social and intellectual levels, created a colonial culture uniquely prepared to resist centralized control. This growing sense of autonomy was nurtured by the political reality of colonial governance. For much of the 17th and 18th centuries, Britain governed its North American colonies with a policy of salutary neglect. Initiated by Prime Minister Robert Walpole, this unofficial policy involved the lax enforcement of parliamentary laws, particularly the Navigation Acts that regulated colonial trade. As long as the colonies remained loyal and contributed to Britain's economic prosperity, the Crown allowed them a significant degree of self-government. This freedom enabled the colonies to develop their own robust political institutions, such as town meetings in New England and powerful colonial assemblies in every colony, which controlled local legislation and the salaries of royal governors. This long period of de facto independence allowed the colonists to forge a distinct American identity and accustom them to managing their own affairs. When Britain abruptly ended this policy after 1763 and attempted to reassert imperial control, it set a direct course for conflict and revolution. Chapter: Revolution and the New Republic, 1763 to 1800. The Road to Revolution, Imperial Policies and Colonial Resistance. The conclusion of the French and Indian War in 1763 marked a pivotal turning point in the relationship between Great Britain and its North American colonies. A decisive victory for the British left the empire with enormous territorial gains, but also with a staggering national debt and the new administrative challenge of governing vast frontier lands. To manage these new responsibilities and raise revenue, the British government abandoned its long-standing policy of salutary neglect and began to assert more direct political and economic control over the colonies. This sudden shift caught the colonists, who had grown accustomed to a high degree of autonomy, off guard and set in motion a chain of events that would culminate in revolution. The new imperial policy manifested in a series of parliamentary acts designed to extract revenue from the colonies and regulate their affairs. The Sugar Act of 1764 was one of the first such measures. While it lowered the tax on molasses from the French West Indies, it also strengthened enforcement mechanisms, signaling that its primary purpose was to raise revenue, not merely regulate trade, arguing that this was a form of taxation without their consent, as they had no elected representatives in Parliament, a principle that became the rallying cry: no taxation without representation. The conflict escalated dramatically with the Stamp Act of 1765, the first direct tax levied on the American colonies. The act required that a tax stamp be affixed to all printed materials, from legal documents and newspapers to playing cards. The response was swift and widespread. Colonial assemblies sent petitions of protest. Delegates from 9 colonies convened the Stamp Act Congress, which issued a Declaration of Rights asserting that only their own legislatures could tax them. On the ground, popular resistance grew, led by groups like the Sons of Liberty, who organized boycotts of British goods and used intimidation to force stamp distributors to resign. Faced with economic pressure from British merchants hurt by the boycotts, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act in 1766, but simultaneously passed the Declaratory Act, asserting its full authority to make laws for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. In 1767, Parliament tried again with the Townshend Acts, which imposed duties on imported goods such as glass. The revenue from these taxes was designated to pay the salaries of colonial governors and judges, a move the colonists saw as a direct attack on the power of their assemblies, which had traditionally controlled the purse strings. The colonies renewed their non-importation agreements, organized as the Daughters of Liberty, playing a crucial role by promoting the use of homespun cloth and boycotting British tea. The British sent troops to Boston to enforce the acts, heightening tensions and leading to the Boston Massacre in 1770. The final catalyst came after the Boston Tea Party in 1773. In retaliation, Parliament passed a series of punitive measures in 1774, known in the colonies as the Intolerable Acts. These acts closed the port of Boston, altered the Massachusetts Charter to reduce the power of its representative government, and expanded the Quartering Act. Rather than isolating Massachusetts as intended, these harsh measures unified the colonies in opposition. In a critical institutional innovation, the Committees of Correspondence, which had been established to share information and coordinate resistance, spread the news of the acts and called for a united response. Delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies convened the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia to orchestrate a collective resistance to British tyranny, marking a decisive step on the road to independence. The War for Independence, ideology, it was a revolution in political thought. Its success depended on a powerful ideological foundation, resilience on the battlefield, and crucial international support. The ideological core of the revolution was articulated in the Declaration of Independence, adopted by the Second Continental Congress on July 4, 1776. Primarily authored by Thomas Jefferson, the document was a masterwork of Enlightenment philosophy, drawing heavily on John Locke's theory of the social contract. It began not with a specific grievance that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The Declaration argued that governments are instituted to secure these rights and derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. It then presented a long list of grievances against King George III, portraying him as a tyrant who had violated the social contract and thus forfeited his right to rule the colonies. This document transformed a dispute over taxes and representation into a universal struggle for liberty, providing a powerful moral and philosophical justification for independence. The military conflict began in earnest with the skirmishes at Lexington and Concord in April 1775. The Continental Army, led by George Washington, faced the formidable challenge of confronting the most powerful military force in the world. The early years of the war were marked by significant hardships and defeats, including the loss of New York City and the brutal winter encampment at Valley Forge. A critical turning point came in October 1777 with the American victory at the Battle of Saratoga. This decisive victory convinced France that the American cause was viable, leading to a formal alliance in 1778. The French alliance was indispensable to the American victory. France provided essential financial aid, military supplies, experienced officers, and, most critically, its powerful navy. The French fleet's blockade of the Chesapeake Bay was instrumental in trapping the British Army under Lord Cornwallis at the Battle of Yorktown in 1781. The subsequent surrender of Cornwallis's army effectively ended major military operations and secured American independence. The war effort was sustained by a diverse coalition of people. Women played crucial roles on the home front, organizing boycotts and fundraising drives. African Americans, both free and enslaved, fought on both sides of the conflict. Thousands served in the Continental Army, often in integrated units, in the hope that the revolution's ideals of liberty would be extended to them. Many others sought freedom by joining the British, who promised emancipation to those who fought for the crown. Native American tribes also found themselves caught in the conflict, with most siding with the British, whom they viewed as a more reliable partner in protecting their lands from the relentless westward expansion of American settlers. For these diverse groups, the war for independence was a complex struggle with varied motivations and profoundly different outcomes. Governing a new nation, the Articles of Confederation and the Constitutional Convention victory in the Revolutionary War secured independence, but it also presented the new United States with the formidable challenge of creating a stable and effective government. The first attempt, the Articles of Confederation, reflected the deep-seated fear of centralized power that had fueled the Revolution. Ratified in 1781, the Articles established a firm league of friendship among the states, creating a weak national government with a unicameral Congress in which each state had one vote. The central government under the Articles lacked fundamental powers. It could not levy taxes, regulate interstate or foreign commerce, or raise a standing army. To fund its operations, it had to request money from the states, which were often unwilling to comply, leaving the national government perpetually underfunded and unable to pay its war debts. Furthermore, its inability to regulate trade hindered economic recovery and allowed foreign powers like Britain and Spain to exploit the disunity among the states. The weaknesses of the Articles became glaringly apparent in the mid-1780s. The economic turmoil of the post-war period, combined with high state taxes and debt, fell heavily on farmers. In the winter of 1786-87, this discontent erupted into Shays's Rebellion, an armed uprising of indebted farmers in western Massachusetts led by Revolutionary War veteran Daniel Shays. The rebels shut down courts to prevent foreclosures on their farms. The national government was powerless to intervene, and the rebellion had to be suppressed by a privately funded militia. This event shocked the nation's elite and served as a powerful catalyst, convincing leaders like George Washington and James Madison that the Articles were inadequate and that a stronger national government was necessary to ensure domestic order and the survival of the Republic. In response, delegates from 12 states convened in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787 for the Constitutional Convention. Initially tasked with revising the Articles, the delegates quickly decided to draft an entirely new framework of government. The convention was marked by intense debates over the structure and powers of the new government. A central conflict arose between large and small states over the issue of representation in the national legislature. The large states favored the Virginia Plan, which proposed proportional representation based on population, while the small states supported the New Jersey Plan, which called for equal representation for each state. The dispute was resolved by the Great Compromise, or Connecticut Compromise, which created a bicameral Congress, the House of Representatives, with proportional representation, with equal representation, 2 senators per state. The divisive issue of slavery also required a series of difficult compromises. Southern delegates insisted that enslaved people be counted for the purpose of representation, while Northern delegates argued they should be counted for taxation. The result was the 3/5 Compromise, which stipulated that 3/5 of the enslaved population would be counted for both representation in the House and for direct taxation. Another compromise protected the transatlantic slave trade from congressional prohibition for at least 20 years. The delegates also debated the nature of the executive branch, ultimately creating a single president elected not by popular vote, a system designed to balance the influence of different states and serve as a check on direct democracy. The resulting constitution established a government built on 3 core institutional principles. Federalism divided power between the national government and the state governments. Separation of powers distributed the national government's authority among 3 distinct branches: the legislative, Congress, the executive president, and the judicial, Supreme Court. A system of checks and balances was created, giving each branch the means to limit the power of the other 2, for example, the president's power to veto legislation passed by Congress. This intricate framework was designed to create a government strong enough to be effective, yet constrained enough to protect liberty. The Federalist era, Washington, Hamilton, and the rise of political parties. The creation of the Constitution in 1787 did not end the debate over the nature of American government, it merely shifted it to a new arena. The process of ratification and the challenges of the first decade under the new government exposed deep ideological divisions that led to the formation of the nation's first political parties. The campaign for ratification pitted 2 opposing groups against each other. The Federalists, led by figures like Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay, supported the Constitution and advocated for a strong, centralized national government. To make their case, they authored a series of 85 essays known as the Federalist Papers, which were published in New York newspapers. These essays provided a detailed analysis of the Constitution, arguing that its system of checks and balances and separation of powers would prevent tyranny and that a strong union was necessary to control the violence of faction. Opposing them were the Anti-Federalists, who feared that the new Constitution created a national government that was too powerful and would threaten individual liberties and the sovereignty of the states. Their most potent argument was the Constitution's lack of a Bill of Rights to protect fundamental freedoms. The debate was ultimately resolved when Federalists promised to add a Bill of Rights as the first order of business for the new Congress. This compromise secured ratification, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, guaranteeing freedoms of speech. George Washington was unanimously elected as the first president in 1789, and his leadership was crucial in establishing the legitimacy of the new government. He set numerous important precedents, including the creation of a cabinet of advisors, the assertion of the president's role in foreign policy, a tradition that would last until the 20th century. The central conflicts of Washington's administration revolved around the ambitious economic program of his Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton's financial plan aimed to establish the nation's credit and create a powerful, integrated national economy. Its key components were the federal assumption of state debts incurred during the Revolution, the creation of a national bank, the Bank of the United States. This plan was deeply divisive. It favored commercial and financial interests, who envisioned an agrarian republic of independent yeoman farmers and feared that Hamilton's system would create a corrupt, centralized power structure similar to Britain's. The federal government's power was tested in 1794 when farmers in western Pennsylvania rose up in the Whiskey Rebellion to protest a federal excise tax on distilled spirits. Washington's decisive action in leading a militia to suppress the rebellion demonstrated the new government's will and ability to enforce its laws. These fundamental disagreements over economic policy, the proper role of government, and foreign affairs, particularly the French Revolution, led to the formation of the first organized political parties. Hamilton's supporters became known as the Federalist Party, while Jefferson and Madison's opposition coalition formed the Democratic-Republican Party. This development was not an unforeseen accident, but the logical institutional outcome of two deeply rooted competing ideologies about the nation's economic, social, and political future. The partisan conflict intensified under Washington's successor, John Adams. His presidency was dominated by a quasi-war with France, which led the Federalist-controlled Congress to pass the controversial Alien and Sedition Acts in 1798. These laws raised residency requirements for citizenship, authorized the president to deport dangerous aliens, made it a crime to publish false, scandalous, and malicious writing against the government. The acts were widely seen as a partisan tool to suppress dissent and silence the Democratic-Republican press, articulated in the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. The backlash against these acts contributed to a sweeping Democratic-Republican victory in the election of 1800. The election of Thomas Jefferson, dubbed the Revolution of 1800, was a landmark event, marking the first peaceful transfer of executive power from one opposing party to another, and confirming the viability of the young republic's political system. Chapter: An Expanding Nation in an Age of Reform, 1800-1840 Fort. The Jeffersonian Republic and Westward Expansion. The presidency of Thomas Jefferson marked a shift in the nation's political direction, emphasizing a smaller central government and an agrarian vision for the republic. Yet, paradoxically, Jefferson's tenure was defined by a dramatic expansion of both national territory and federal power. The most significant event of his presidency was the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. In a stunning diplomatic development, Napoleon Bonaparte of France offered to sell the entire Louisiana Territory, a vast expanse of 827,000 square miles stretching from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains, to the United States for $15 million. The acquisition was a strategic triumph, as it doubled the size of the country, secured American control over the vital Mississippi River and the port of New Orleans. However, the purchase posed a constitutional dilemma for Jefferson, a staunch advocate of a strict interpretation of the Constitution, which made no provision for the president to acquire territory. Ultimately, Jefferson rationalized the action as being in the nation's best interest, an exercise of implied powers that set a major precedent for future presidential authority. To explore this vast new domain, Jefferson commissioned the Lewis and Clark Expedition, 1804-1806. Led by Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, the Corps of Discovery ascended the Missouri River, crossed the Rocky Mountains, and reached the Pacific Ocean. The expedition was a monumental success, yielding a wealth of scientific and geographic knowledge. The explorers documented hundreds of plant and animal species previously unknown to American science, mapped the new territory, and established diplomatic and trade relations with dozens of Native American tribes. Jefferson's second term was increasingly consumed by foreign policy challenges arising from the Napoleonic Wars between Britain and France. Both powers violated American neutrality, but the British practice of impressment, the seizure of American sailors from U.S. ships for service in the Royal Navy, was particularly galling. In an attempt to use economic pressure to force respect for American rights, Jefferson enacted the Embargo Act of 1807, which prohibited all American ships from leaving for foreign ports. The embargo proved to be a costly failure. It devastated the American economy, particularly in shipping-dependent New England, far more than it hurt Britain or France, and was widely evaded through smuggling. The unresolved tensions with Britain eventually led Jefferson's successor, James Madison, to declare war in 1812. The War of 1812 was fought over issues of maritime rights, British support for Native American resistance on the frontier, and a desire among some Americans, war hawks, to conquer Canada. The war was a difficult and often mismanaged conflict that saw the burning of Washington, D.C. by British forces, such as the naval battle on Lake Erie and Andrew Jackson's decisive triumph at the Battle of New Orleans, fought after the peace treaty was signed, fostered a powerful wave of nationalism. The war's aftermath had several key consequences. It confirmed American independence, shattered the strengths of Native American resistance east of the Mississippi, which had been discredited by its opposition to the war at the Hartford Convention. The period following the war, marked by political unity under the dominant Democratic-Republican Party and a surge of national pride, became known as the Era of Good Feelings. The Market Revolution, Economic and Social Transformations. The early 19th century witnessed a fundamental transformation of the American economy, a period historians call the Market Revolution. This was not a single event, but a complex process involving a shift from a localized, subsistence-based agrarian economy to an integrated national marketplace driven by industry and commerce. This revolution reshaped how Americans worked, lived, and related to one another, laying the groundwork for the modern capitalist society. Several key economic developments fueled this transformation. Technological innovation was a primary driver. Eli Whitney's development of interchangeable parts revolutionized manufacturing, allowing for the mass production of goods that had previously been handmade by skilled artisans. This principle, first applied to muskets, soon spread to other industries. The growth of factories, particularly textile mills in New England, created new centers of production and drew workers from the countryside to burgeoning urban centers. This industrialization was powered by a concurrent revolution in transportation and communication. The construction of canals, most notably the Erie Canal, and the advent of the steamboat and the railroad created a national network that linked the agricultural West, the industrializing Northeast, and the cotton-producing South, making it possible to transport goods and crops over long distances cheaply and efficiently. The social consequences of the market revolution were profound and often contradictory. The period sparked explosive economic growth and created new personal wealth, but it also widened the gap between the rich and the poor. A new class of wealthy industrialists and capitalists emerged, while a growing class of property-less wage workers became dependent on factory labor for their livelihood. Many of these workers, including women and children, labored for low wages in difficult and often dangerous conditions, becoming trapped in cycles of poverty. The traditional rhythms of farm life were replaced by the disciplined, time-oriented structure of the factory. The revolution also spurred increased urbanization as people flocked to cities in search of employment, leading to overcrowding and the social problems associated with rapid, unplanned growth. While the market revolution improved the standard of living for many by making consumer goods more widely available and affordable, it also created a more impersonal, marked by devastating economic depressions. The rise of Jacksonian democracy, politics for the common man. The social and economic upheavals of the market revolution were mirrored by a dramatic transformation in American politics. The era of good feelings dissolved in the contentious presidential election of 1824, giving way to a new, more populous and participatory political culture known as Jacksonian democracy. This era was characterized by the expansion of suffrage, a belief in a strong executive, and a fervent challenge to what was perceived as entrenched economic and political elites. The catalyst for this new political alignment was the election of 1824. In a four-way race, Andrew Jackson won the most popular and electoral votes but failed to secure the required majority in the Electoral College. The election was thrown into the House of Representatives, where Speaker of the House Henry Clay, who had finished fourth, threw his support behind John Quincy Adams. When Adams won and subsequently appointed Clay as his Secretary of State, Jackson's supporters were outraged, denouncing the outcome as a corrupt bargain that had thwarted the will of the people. This accusation fueled popular resentment against the established political order and became the central rallying cry for Jackson's successful presidential campaign in 1828. Jackson's presidency, 1829 to 1837, championed the cause of the common man against the forces of aristocracy and privilege. A key feature of this era was the dramatic expansion of political participation. Most states eliminated property qualifications for voting, extending the franchise to virtually all white males. This democratization of politics led to higher voter turnouts and a more boisterous, partisan political culture. Jackson also instituted the spoils system, rewarding his political supporters with government jobs, which he defended as a way to reform government by rotating officials and preventing the emergence of a permanent. At the heart of Jackson's presidency was his assault on institutions he believed concentrated power and wealth in the hands of a few. The most significant of these conflicts was the Bank War. Jackson viewed the Second Bank of the United States as a corrupt, unconstitutional monopoly that benefited wealthy Eastern elites at the expense of farmers and workers. He vetoed the bill to recharter the bank. He moved to dismantle it by withdrawing federal deposits and placing them in state-chartered pet banks. The destruction of the National Bank contributed to a period of economic instability that culminated in the Panic of 1837. Jackson's presidency also saw a major confrontation over states' rights in the nullification crisis. In response to high federal tariffs that they argued unfairly burdened the agricultural South, South Carolina, led by Jackson's own Vice President John C. Calhoun, asserted the right of a state to nullify, or declare void, a federal law within its borders. Vehemently rejected this doctrine, declaring that disunion by armed force is treason. He threatened to use military force to enforce the tariff. While Jackson championed the rights of the common white man, his policies were devastating for Native Americans. Driven by a desire to open up land in the Southeast for white settlement and cotton cultivation, Jackson pursued a policy of Indian removal. He signed the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which authorized the federal government to negotiate treaties to forcibly relocate the Cherokee. Despite a Supreme Court ruling in favor of the Cherokee, known as the Trail of Tears, resulted in the deaths of thousands. A ferment of reform, the Second Great Awakening, combined with the social anxieties produced by the market revolution, created fertile ground for a wave of social and moral reform movements. Energized by the religious fervor of the Second Great Awakening, these movements sought to perfect American society by combating a wide range of perceived evils, from slavery and alcohol consumption to the unequal treatment of women. The Second Great Awakening was a Protestant religious revival that swept the nation in the early 19th century. Unlike the Calvinist determinism of the First Great Awakening, this revival emphasized individual free will, personal salvation through good works. This optimistic and activist theology inspired countless Americans to dedicate themselves to social reform, viewing it as a moral and religious duty to eradicate sin from society. The most significant and radical of these reform movements was abolitionism. The 1830s saw a shift in the anti-slavery movement from a focus on gradual emancipation and colonization to a demand for the immediate and uncompensated abolition of slavery, led by figures like William Lloyd Garrison, who published the influential anti-slavery newspaper The Liberator. The abolitionist movement grew in strength and militancy, becoming a major force in the escalating sectional conflict. The women's rights movement also gained significant momentum during this period, often growing out of women's involvement in the abolitionist cause. Women like Sarah and Angelina Grimke, who were criticized for speaking publicly against slavery, began to argue that women, like enslaved people, were denied their basic rights as citizens. This activism culminated in the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, organized by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott. The convention issued a Declaration of Sentiments, modeled on the Declaration of Independence, which proclaimed that all men and women are created equal, and listed grievances against the disenfranchisement and oppression of women. Most radically, it called for women's suffrage, launching the organized movement for the right to vote. The longest-lasting and most broad-based reform effort of the era sought to curb the consumption of alcohol, which was seen as a major source of crime. Organizations like the American Temperance Society were formed, and millions of Americans pledged to abstain from alcohol. The era also saw the rise of utopian communities, experimental societies that sought to create ideal social and economic arrangements. Communities like Brook Farm, founded by transcendentalists, and the Oneida community, which practiced complex marriage, attempted to put their radical social theories into practice. These reform movements were a direct response to the anxieties of the market revolution. Energized by the moral fervor of the Second Great Awakening, abolitionists fought the sin of slavery. Temperance advocates fought the sin of alcohol, all using the new political language of popular sovereignty to demand change and remake American society. Chapter: A House Divided, Sectionalism. The ideology of manifest destiny. The belief that the United States was divinely ordained to expand its dominion across the North American continent captured the national imagination. This expansionist fervor led to the annexation of Texas in 1845 and the Mexican-American War from 1846 to 1848. The war resulted in a stunning American victory and the acquisition of a vast new territory, which included present-day California. This territorial gain came at a steep price, as it immediately raised the explosive question of whether slavery would be allowed to expand into these new lands, a question that would shatter the fragile political compromises that had held the nation together. For decades, the issue of slavery's expansion had been managed through a series of delicate sectional compromises. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 had admitted Missouri to the Union as a slave state and Maine as a free state, while prohibiting slavery in the rest of the Louisiana Purchase territory north of the 36°30' parallel. This compromise maintained the balance of power between free and slave states in the Senate for over 30 years. The acquisition of the Mexican Cession upset this balance and led to the Compromise of 1850. This complex package of legislation admitted California as a free state, allowed the territories of Utah and New Mexico to decide the issue of slavery by popular sovereignty, and abolished the slave trade, but not slavery itself, in Washington. Critically, to appease the South, the compromise included a new and much more stringent Fugitive Slave Act. This law required federal officials and citizens in free states to assist in the capture and return of escaped slaves, denying alleged fugitives the right to a jury trial. The act was met with outrage in the North, where it was seen as a moral and legal outrage that forced Northerners to become complicit in the institution of slavery. It led to open defiance, violent confrontations, and the passage of personal liberty laws in several Northern states to counteract its effects. The sectional peace bought by the compromise was short-lived. Senator Stephen Douglas of Illinois pushed through the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which organized the territories of Kansas and Nebraska and explicitly repealed the Missouri Compromise line, allowing settlers in those territories to decide the slavery issue by popular sovereignty. The act reignited the sectional firestorm. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers flooded into Kansas, each side determined to control the territory's political future. This led to widespread fraud, the establishment of rival territorial governments, and a brutal guerrilla war known as Bleeding Kansas, a bloody prelude to the Civil War. The escalating political crisis was mirrored by a cultural one. In 1852, Harriet Beecher Stowe published Uncle Tom's Cabin, a novel that depicted the brutality and inhumanity of slavery in vivid, emotional terms. The book was an unprecedented bestseller, selling 300,000 copies in its first year in the United States alone. It had a profound impact on public opinion, galvanizing abolitionist sentiment in the North by personalizing the evils of slavery and provoking a furious backlash in the South, where it was condemned as slanderous propaganda. The novel brought the moral argument against slavery into the homes of millions and made compromise on the issue increasingly difficult. The path to secession, political breakdown, and the election of 1860. The crisis of the 1850s shattered the existing political system. The Whig Party, unable to bridge the sectional divide over slavery, disintegrated. In its place, a new political force emerged in the North, the Republican Party, founded in 1854 in opposition to the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The Republican Party was a purely sectional party whose central platform was the prevention of slavery's expansion into the Western territories. Its rapid rise signaled a fundamental realignment in American politics, as national parties gave way to parties based on sectional interests. The Supreme Court intervened in the crisis in 1857 with its landmark decision in Dred Scott v. Sanford. The case involved Dred Scott, an enslaved man who sued for his freedom on the grounds that he had lived in a free state and a free territory. In a sweeping and highly controversial ruling, Chief Justice Roger B. Taney declared that African Americans, whether enslaved or free, were not citizens of the United States and therefore had no right to sue in federal court, ruling that the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional because Congress had no authority to ban slavery in the territories, as doing so would violate the Fifth Amendment's protection of property in this case. The decision was a stunning victory for the South, as it appeared to open all federal territories to slavery. In the North, it was met with fury and defiance, as Republicans and abolitionists saw it as proof of a slave power conspiracy to dominate the federal government. The nation was pushed closer to the brink in October 1859 by the actions of the radical abolitionist John Brown, convinced that only violent action could end slavery. Brown and a small band of followers launched a raid on the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, hoping to seize weapons and incite a massive slave uprising. The raid failed, Brown was captured, tried for treason, and executed. His actions and his dignified conduct during his trial polarized the nation. In the South, he was viewed as a dangerous terrorist, and the raid confirmed Southerners' deepest fears of a Northern conspiracy to spark a race war. In the North, while many condemned his methods, others, particularly abolitionists, hailed him as a martyr for the cause of freedom. The election of 1860 was the final catalyst for disunion. The Democratic Party split along sectional lines, with Northern Democrats nominating Stephen Douglas and Southern Democrats nominating John C. Breckinridge. A fourth party, the Constitutional Union Party, nominated John Bell. This division allowed the Republican candidate to win the presidency with a majority of the electoral votes, but with less than 40% of the popular vote and without carrying a single Southern state. For the South, Lincoln's election, on a platform explicitly opposed to the expansion of slavery, was the final straw. They viewed it as a hostile act that threatened their way of life and their peculiar institution. On December 20, 1860, South Carolina became the first state to secede from the Union. By February 1861, 6 other Deep South states had followed, and the Confederate States of America was formed, setting the stage for civil war. The Civil War, a nation at war with itself, 1861 to 1865, the American Civil War, which began with the Confederate attack on Fort Sumter in April 1861, was the most devastating conflict in the nation's history. It was a war fought not against a foreign power, pitting brother against brother in a struggle to determine the future of the Union and the institution of slavery. At the outset of the war, the Union held significant material advantages. The North had a much larger population, approximately 22 million to the Confederacy's 9 million, of whom 3.5 million were enslaved, a vastly superior industrial capacity with 90% of the nation's factories. A more extensive railroad network. The Confederacy, however, had its own advantages. It was fighting a defensive war in its own territory, which meant it only had to resist being conquered, not conquer the North. It had a strong military tradition that produced a cadre of talented officers, most notably Robert E. Lee and its soldiers were highly motivated to defend their homes and way of life. The war was fought on multiple fronts, but several key battles and campaigns proved to be decisive turning points. In the Eastern Theater, the Battle of Antietam in September 1862 was the single bloodiest day in American history. Though tactically a draw, it was a strategic Union victory as it halted Lee's first invasion of the North. This victory gave President Lincoln the political standing to issue the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. The proclamation, which went into effect on January 1, 1863, declared that all enslaved people in the rebellious states shall be thenceforward and forever free. This momentous act transformed the purpose of the war. It was no longer just a struggle to preserve the Union, but also a war to end slavery. This moral cause energized the Union effort, prevented European powers like Britain and France from intervening on behalf of the Confederacy, who would go on to serve with distinction. The summer of 1863 marked the war's most critical turning point. In the East, the Battle of Gettysburg, July 1-3, ended Lee's second and final invasion of the North in a decisive Union victory, crippling the Army of Northern Virginia. Simultaneously, in the west, General Ulysses S. Grant captured the strategic fortress of Vicksburg, Mississippi on July 4 after a lengthy siege. The fall of Vicksburg gave the Union complete control of the Mississippi River, splitting the Confederacy in two. Grant's success in the West, characterized by his relentless and strategic approach, led Lincoln to appoint him commander of all Union armies in 1864. Grant implemented a strategy of total war, applying constant pressure on Lee's army in Virginia, while General William T. Sherman conducted his devastating march to the sea to Georgia and the Carolinas, destroying the South's economic resources and will to fight. This relentless pressure ultimately proved successful, leading to Lee's surrender to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, 1865, effectively ending the war. The war had a profound impact on the home front. Both sides resorted to conscription to fill their armies. The Union's industrial economy boomed with war production, while the Confederacy's agrarian economy, crippled by the Union naval blockade and the destruction of its infrastructure, collapsed. Women on both sides took on new roles, managing farms and businesses and working as nurses. The war was a shared national trauma, bringing death and hardship to nearly every American family. Known as Reconstruction, 1865 to 1877, was a tumultuous and ultimately tragic era dedicated to rebuilding the South, reintegrating the former Confederate states into the Union. The era was marked by a profound conflict over the direction and control of this process, pitting the executive branch against Congress and revealing the deep-seated racism that persisted in the nation. The initial phase, known as Presidential Reconstruction, 1865 to 1867, was guided by the lenient policies of Presidents Abraham Lincoln and, after his assassination, Andrew Johnson. Their primary goal was the swift restoration of the Union. Johnson's plan offered pardons to most white Southerners who took an oath of loyalty, restored their property, except for enslaved people. New all-white Southern governments were quickly formed, which proceeded to pass restrictive black codes designed to control the labor and behavior of African Americans, effectively returning them to a state of quasi-slavery. This leniency and the enactment of the black codes outraged many in the North, particularly the radical Republicans in Congress. Led by figures like Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner, the radicals believed that presidential reconstruction was a betrayal of the war's purpose. They sought to punish the former Confederacy, transform Southern society, and, most importantly, secure full civil and political rights for African Americans. In 1866, the radicals gained control of Congress and launched their own program, known as Radical or Congressional Reconstruction. Over President Johnson's vetoes, they passed landmark legislation, including the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and the Reconstruction Acts of 1867, which divided the South into 5 military districts and required the states to ratify new constitutions that guaranteed voting rights for all men. Radical Reconstruction had several significant successes. The most enduring were the ratification of 3 constitutional amendments, the 13th Amendment 1865, which granted citizenship to all persons born in the United States and guaranteed them equal protection of the laws, which prohibited the denial of the right to vote based on race. Another major success was the Freedmen's Bureau, a federal agency that provided essential aid to millions of former slaves and poor whites. While it struggled with funding and political opposition, the Bureau's greatest achievement was in education. It established thousands of schools, including colleges like Howard and Fisk, laying the foundation for public education in the South. These changes brought about an unprecedented experiment in interracial democracy, as African American men voted in large numbers and were elected to offices at all levels of government. Despite these gains, Reconstruction ultimately failed. A primary reason was its failure to provide economic independence for the formerly enslaved. Plans for widespread land redistribution were abandoned, forcing most freed people into a system of sharecropping, where they farmed land owned by whites in exchange for a share of the crop. This system often trapped them in a cycle of debt and economic dependency that was little better than slavery. The most significant cause of failure, however, was a violent and successful counter-revolution waged by white Southerners committed to restoring white supremacy. Most notably, the Ku Klux Klan, KKK, emerged as the paramilitary arm of the Democratic Party, the federal government's response to this insurgency. Though initially forceful with the passage of the Enforcement Acts, eventually waned as Northern resolve faded in the face of economic depression and a growing desire for national reconciliation. The end of Reconstruction came with the Compromise of 1877. To resolve the disputed presidential election of 1876, Republican and Democratic leaders struck a deal. Republican Rutherford B. Hayes would become president, and in return, he would withdraw the last federal troops from the South. The withdrawal of these troops marked the abandonment of the federal government's commitment to protecting the rights of African Americans, leaving them to the mercy of the white Redeemer governments that quickly dismantled the reforms of the era. The failure of Reconstruction was not due to the inability of African Americans to participate in democracy, ushering in the long and brutal era of Jim Crow. The Challenges of a Modern Nation, 1865 present, chapter, The Gilded Age, Industrialization. The United States underwent an unprecedented industrial transformation, emerging as a global economic powerhouse. famously dubbed the Gilded Age by Mark Twain, was characterized by rapid economic growth. The era was defined by a new class of industrialists whose methods and impact generated a fierce debate, casting them as both visionary captains of industry who built the modern American economy and ruthless robber barons who amassed fortunes through exploitation and corruption. The railroad was the engine of this industrial revolution. Aided by massive government land grants and subsidies, railroad networks expanded across the continent, linking raw materials to factories and factories to a new national market. Cornelius Vanderbilt, who had built an empire in shipping, shifted his focus to railroads in the 1860s through ruthless competition and consolidation, creating one of the first giant corporations in American history and helping to make railroad transportation more efficient. The railroads, in turn, fueled a massive demand for steel, the essential material for tracks, bridges, and the new skyscrapers that began to define the urban landscape. Andrew Carnegie, a Scottish immigrant who rose from poverty, came to dominate the steel industry. He did so by embracing technological innovation, most notably the Bessemer process for mass-producing steel cheaply, and by pioneering a business model known as vertical integration. Carnegie controlled every stage of the production process, from the iron ore and coal mines to the steel mills and the transportation networks that brought the final product to market. This model maximized efficiency and allowed him to drive down costs and undersell all competitors. By 1900, the Carnegie Steel Company was the largest industrial corporation in the world. The oil industry experienced a similar consolidation under John D. Rockefeller. Recognizing the growing demand for kerosene for lighting, Rockefeller established the Standard Oil Company in 1870. He achieved a near-total monopoly on oil refining business through a strategy of horizontal integration, buying out or driving his competitors out of business. Rockefeller used predatory pricing, preferential rates from railroads to undercut his rivals. By the 1880s, the Standard Oil Trust controlled about 90% of the nation's oil refining capacity. The prevailing economic ideologies of the era provided justification for this unprecedented concentration of wealth. Laissez-faire capitalism held that the government should not interfere in the free market. This was complemented by the social theory of social Darwinism, which applied Charles Darwin's concept of survival of the fittest to human society, arguing that the success of industrial titans was a product of natural superiority and that government intervention to help the poor or regulate business would interfere with this natural process. While these men created vast industrial enterprises that modernized the nation, their success was often built on the exploitation of workers. The new urban landscape, immigration, and city life. The industrial boom of the Gilded Age was inextricably linked to two other defining transformations: the rapid growth of cities and a massive wave of immigration. The factory system created a concentrated demand for labor, pulling millions of people from rural America and from around the world into burgeoning urban centers. This influx of people reshaped the nation's demographic and social fabric, creating a new, diverse, and often volatile urban landscape. Between 1870 and 1900, the urban population of the United States tripled. Cities like New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia became magnets for job seekers, their skylines transformed by steel-framed skyscrapers and their streets crowded with newcomers. This explosive growth, however, far outpaced the capacity of urban infrastructure. Many city dwellers, particularly the working poor and new immigrants, lived in squalid conditions. They were packed into overcrowded tenements, low-rise apartment buildings with inadequate plumbing, ventilation, and sanitation, where disease spread rapidly. A significant portion of this new urban population was composed of immigrants. The Gilded Age witnessed a dramatic shift in the sources of immigration, while earlier waves had come primarily from Northern and Western Europe, Germany. The so-called new immigrants of the late 19th century arrived predominantly from Southern and Eastern Europe. These newcomers were often culturally and religiously different from the majority of Americans. Many were Catholic, Jewish, or Eastern Orthodox, and few spoke English. They arrived with little money or education and took unskilled jobs in factories and mines for low wages. To cope with the challenges of a new country, they often settled in ethnic enclaves within the cities, such as Little Italy or Jewish ghettos, where they could preserve their languages. This wave of new immigration provoked a backlash from some native-born Americans. This nativist sentiment was fueled by a combination of economic anxiety, religious prejudice, and racial theories that deemed the new immigrants inferior to those from Northern Europe. Labor unions feared that immigrants would drive down wages, while Protestant leaders were alarmed by the growing number of Catholics and Jews. This hostility led to calls for immigration restriction. The most severe manifestation of this was the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which barred all Chinese laborers from entering the country, marking the first time the United States had restricted immigration based on nationality. The Gilded Age city was a place of stark contrasts. It was a landscape of innovation and opportunity, but also one of extreme poverty and social division. The lavish mansions of industrialists stood just miles from the cramped and unsanitary tenements of the workers whose labor built their fortunes. This immense disparity between the wealthy elite and the impoverished working class created a society rife with tension and conflict, challenging the American ideal of an egalitarian republic. Labor and unrest, the struggle for workers' rights. The immense wealth and productivity of the Gilded Age were built on the backs of an industrial working class that faced grueling and often dehumanizing conditions. The logic of industrial capitalism, driven by the relentless pursuit of efficiency and profit, treated labor as just another commodity to be purchased as cheaply as possible. This reality gave rise to a powerful and often violent struggle between workers and employers over wages, working conditions, and the right to organize. Life for the industrial worker was precarious and harsh. The average workday was 10 to 12 hours long, 6 days a week, for wages that often hovered near the poverty line. Workplaces, from steel mills and coal mines to textile factories and meatpacking plants, were notoriously dangerous with little regard for safety. Accidents were common, and workers who were injured or killed received little to no compensation. Child labor was widespread, as children could be paid less than adults and were small enough to perform certain tasks in mines and factories. Workers had little job security and could be fired at a moment's notice, especially during the frequent economic downturns that plagued the era. In response to these conditions, workers began to organize into labor unions to collectively bargain for better treatment. One of the earliest and most significant national unions was the Knights of Labor. Founded in 1869, the Knights were unique in their inclusivity, welcoming skilled and unskilled workers, women, and African Americans. They pursued a broad reform agenda, advocating for an 8-hour workday, an end to child labor, and the creation of worker-owned cooperatives. In contrast, the American Federation of Labor, AFL, founded in 1886 and led by Samuel Gompers, was more conservative. The AFL was a federation of craft unions focusing on skilled white male workers. It eschewed broad social reforms in favor of bread-and-butter issues, higher wages, which it sought to achieve through collective bargaining and strikes. The conflict between labor and capital frequently erupted into open warfare, with the government and courts consistently siding with employers. The Great Railroad Strike of 1877, the nation's first major nationwide strike, was sparked by wage cuts and paralyzed rail traffic across the country. It was violently suppressed by state militias and federal troops, leaving more than 100 people dead. The Haymarket Riot of 1886 began as a peaceful rally in Chicago for an 8-hour day, when a bomb was thrown at police. The ensuing violence and the subsequent trial and execution of anarchist leaders created a powerful backlash against the labor movement, which was falsely associated with radicalism and violence. This event contributed to the rapid decline of the Knights of Labor. The Homestead Strike of 1892 at one of Andrew Carnegie's steel mills involved a pitched battle between striking workers and hired Pinkerton private security guards, which was ultimately broken by the state militia, crushing the powerful steelworkers' union. Finally, the Pullman Strike of 1894, a nationwide railroad boycott led by Eugene V. Debs and the American Railway Union, was crushed when President Grover Cleveland sent in federal troops, arguing that the strike was illegally obstructing the U.S. mail. These events demonstrated the immense power of corporations and the government's willingness to use force to defeat organized labor, ensuring that the struggle for workers' rights would be a long and arduous one. Politics of the Gilded Age, corruption, reform, and populism. The politics of the Gilded Age reflected the era's dramatic economic and social transformations. It was a period of high voter turnout and intense partisan loyalty, who felt left behind by the new industrial order. The political system of the era was not weak, but was instead being actively captured by powerful new industrial interests, leading to policies that favored capital over labor and agriculture. At the local level, many large cities were controlled by powerful political machines. These organizations, such as New York City's Tammany Hall, led by William Boss Tweed, maintained power through a system of patronage and graft. They provided essential services to immigrant communities, jobs, food, and legal help in exchange for their votes. While they offered a form of social welfare, they did so through rampant corruption, enriching party bosses and their allies through kickbacks and fraudulent contracts. Corruption was also endemic at the federal level. The administration of President Ulysses S., including the Crédit Mobilier scandal, involving bribes to congressmen to protect a fraudulent railroad construction company, a scheme by distillers and public officials to defraud the government of millions in liquor taxes. This pervasive corruption sparked a movement for civil service reform. For decades, the federal government had operated on the spoils system, where the victorious political party would award government jobs to its loyal supporters regardless of their qualifications. Reformers argued that this system led to incompetence and corruption and advocated for a merit-based system of public employment. The movement gained a tragic impetus in 1881 when President James A. Garfield was assassinated by a disgruntled office seeker. The public outcry following his death led Congress to pass the Pendleton Act of 1883. This landmark legislation established a bipartisan civil service commission and created a system where federal jobs would be awarded based on competitive exams rather than political connections. While the act initially covered only a small percentage of federal jobs, it laid the foundation for a professional, merit-based civil service. The central economic debate in national politics during this period was the tariff. The Republican Party, dominant for much of the era, consistently advocated for high protective tariffs on imported goods. They argued that these tariffs were necessary to protect America's nascent industries from foreign competition and to keep wages high for American workers. Argued that high tariffs hurt consumers by raising prices and harmed farmers by provoking retaliatory tariffs from other countries, which made it harder to sell American agricultural products abroad. The tariff generated huge revenues for the federal government, leading to decades of budget surpluses. This sense of agrarian grievance gave rise to the most significant challenge to the two-party system in the late 19th century. The populist movement, particularly in the West and South, faced a difficult economic reality of falling crop prices, which made it difficult to pay their debts. They organized into farmers' alliances and, in the early 1890s, formed the People's Party, or Populist Party. The Populist platform was a radical critique of Gilded Age capitalism. It called for government ownership of railroads, the direct election of senators, the free and unlimited coinage of silver to increase the money supply and help debtors. Though the Populist Party ultimately failed to win a presidential election, many of its reform ideas would be adopted by the major parties during the progressive era that followed.